Good afternoon. My name is Paul Ryer, and I'm the Director of Scholar Programs here at the School for Advanced Research. Welcome back to our colloquium series for 2022. Today's speaker is Gianna May Sanchez, one of our Mellon Fellows for 2022 to 2023, and special thanks to the Mellon Foundation for sponsoring this fellowship. Gianna May Sanchez is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Michigan, and her talk today is titled Grandmothering Midwives, Negotiation, Legislation, and Medical Authority in the New Mexico Birthing Room, 1880 to 1950. Please join me in welcoming Gianna May Sanchez. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for that introduction. I would like to start off by thanking Michael Brown, Paul Ryer, Ashley Flores, and the rest of the amazing staff at the School for Advanced Research for providing this opportunity to present my research. I would also like to thank my advisors, Alexandra Minas-Stern and Anthony Mora, and my SAR mentor, Pablo Mitchell, for their guidance, support, and encouragement. Finally, I would like to thank and acknowledge the work and efforts of the midwives, curanderas, and traditional healers that my research examines. I'm constantly in awe of their strength, perseverance, and care that they provided, and I hope my dissertation can contribute to efforts to acknowledge that impact and significance to New Mexico's medical and cultural history. This lecture will serve as a brief introduction to my overall dissertation, Grandmothering Midwives, Negotiation, Legislation, and Medical Authority in the New Mexico Birthing Room, 1880 to 1950, which examines the history of medicine in New Mexico, the professionalization of physicians in the 20th century, and the practice of curanderismo and midwifery. I would like to quickly note that the midwives that I will discuss refer to lay midwives who received much of their training through apprenticeships. These women often drew from traditional healing methods of curanderismo, or Mexican and Mexican-American folk healing practices, and could occasionally be referred to as a curandera or partera. In this presentation, I will refer to them as both a midwife and partera interchangeably. Furthermore, while the racial, national, and ethnic identities of New Mexico can and should be discussed at length, the majority of my presentation refers to the general populace as simply New Mexicans. Although when I refer to rural communities in the state, these towns often comprise a majority of Mexican and Mexican-American descendants, marked as such due to shifts in nationality and territorial borders following U.S. acquisition of what would become the American Southwest. Now, in order to fully understand New Mexico's role in medical history and the significance of midwifery and curanderismo in the state, we first need to understand the foundations of the historical trajectory of medicine and medical practice in the U.S. The transition between the 19th and 20th centuries was marked by a period of medical professionalization and institutionalization. During this time, physicians began to distinguish their practice from other healthcare practitioners based on increasingly defined educational and experiential requirements. In addition, state and territorial legislators developed new laws, regulations, and restrictions on who could practice medicine. Folk healers, especially midwives, were pushed out of their positions by physicians, and births, once traditionally held in the home, were moved to hospitals. The private, female-centered space of the birthing room at home became one controlled by medical and state authorities, a shift that's been examined by scholars like Judah Walter Leavitt in Brought to Bed. Even U.S. territories not fully incorporated into the nation, like New Mexico, followed this trajectory. At the time, in 1880, the territory of New Mexico was seeking entry into the U.S. as a state. To prove its suitability for statehood, the New Mexican territorial legislature and a small community of licensed physicians worked to professionalize and regulate medicine, following a model based on legislation from Illinois. As Pablo Mitchell notes in Coyote Nation, legislators leveraged these efforts to challenge national perceptions of New Mexico as incompatible with white America, wherein New Mexicans were marked as racially inferior and questioned for their suitability to enter the United States as full-fledged citizens. Through these conditions, medical practice became a matter of the state and a symbol of modernization. In physicians and legislatures' idealized version of the territory, medical professionalization would prove successful, and unlicensed practitioners like folk healers, curanderas, and parteras would be phased out of this modern American New Mexico. And yet, in spite of this vested interest in regulating medicine, lay midwives would continue their practice well into the latter half of the 20th century. They would remain as a vital medical resource for women and become a symbol of cultural tradition and resilience. As one account from 1954 noted, quote, "The midwife as part of the drama of birth has almost disappeared from the American scene, her job taken over by hospitals staffed with competent obstetricians and trained nurses. But not so in New Mexico. The lack of nearby physicians in remote areas of the state, coupled with certain ethnological customs, have in the past made la partera indispensable. Instead of pushing the midwife totally aside, however, New Mexico made her an important part of public health activities." To some degree, this reliance upon midwives in New Mexico was a consequence of the state's infrastructural and economic limitations. As the article quoted above noted, remote rural communities were largely inaccessible for physicians, and in the case of pregnancy and birth, a local midwife was often the only birth attendant available. Such conditions were integral to the state's divergent history from the national narrative of medical professionalization that saw the eventual eclipse of midwifery by licensed physicians. However, the lasting utilization of midwives and their eventual praise by the 1954 New Mexico Department of Public Health drew from a far more extensive inclusion of midwifery and folk healing practices as a medical resource in the territory. Rather than a short-lived allowance in response to 20th century medical accessibility and limitations, New Mexico legislative bodies and the medical community understood the continued significance of midwifery as early as 1880 during the territory's bid for statehood. It is this perseverance and continued presence within medicine in New Mexico that my research seeks to address. The process of medical professionalization in New Mexico was slow. Although New Mexico became a territory of the United States in 1850, the amount of U.S. citizens migrating from the east to the west remained small until railroad development reached the region. The expansion of the adjacent Topeka and Santa Fe Railway to the area in 1880, however, made travel far easier. The railroad provided the access needed for physicians and Anglo-Americans overall to reach and settle in New Mexico, although these newcomers still primarily resided in bigger towns along the railway that bisected the territory. The railroad enabled greater migration, which was further spurred by New Mexico's growing reputation as a site of healing for those inflicted with tuberculosis. Las Vegas was one of the communities along the railway that experienced a population boom and quickly became a center of medical activity in the territory. The influx of physicians settling in the area mirrored the town's growth, and their congregation soon led to the formation of the territory's first medical society in Las Vegas. In part concerned with legitimizing their status as medical authorities and intending to contribute to modernization efforts in New Mexico, Las Vegas physicians wasted little time in organizing as a collective. This interest in forming the Las Vegas Medical Society established what physicians hoped would be the guiding voice for medical affairs and future development in New Mexico, and connected them to the community of American physicians across the country. Initial efforts to form the society began in earnest in 1881, with the official formation occurring at the end of January 1882. The Medical Society, for all intents and purposes, served to differentiate members from other medical practitioners and model new standards of medicine that aligned with national trends in legislation and regulation. As its initial bylaws stipulated, members had to be of upstanding moral character and have received a medical degree from a reputable university. While the Las Vegas Medical Society invested their efforts in vetting members and establishing a standard for medical care expertise, their ability to direct policy outside of their network of physicians varied. The Society's authority and ability to enact change wavered as members clashed with governmental officials. Any attempt to establish medical policy, healthcare facilities, or other form of medical regulation was disjointed or short-lived. This lack of power to direct the state's medical professionalization was a constant point of frustration for Society members. As one physician lamented in the 1911 edition of the New Mexico Medical Journal, the past several decades were wrought with failed medical legislation, with the Society trying, quote, all forms, shapes, kinds, and varieties of medical laws, without avail. Alongside these legislative and governmental issues, New Mexico lacked physicians generally and could not maintain complete coverage of the territory. While physicians did travel to New Mexico to establish their practice in greater numbers than earlier in the 19th century, they often clustered within more populous towns close to the railroad like Santa Fe or Las Vegas. More remote locations were largely left to their own devices or had one doctor attending to several towns at once, with miles between each stop. Not all locations along the railroad had access to a physician either. In one instance, an issue of the American Medico-Surgical Bulletin in 1894 solicited for a physician-druggist to move to Maxwell, New Mexico, which otherwise had no physician within 14 miles, even though it was one of the stops on the AT and SF railway. Racial bias also contributed to these limitations of care. There were several physicians clustered in Las Vegas because it had an established medical community and served a greater population of Anglo residents new to New Mexico. This classification of and preference toward Anglo-American patients was an evident factor that limited where physicians settled and, ultimately, diminished the power that Las Vegas Medical Society held when pushing for medical regulation. In 1897, the Secretary of the New Mexico Board of Health, Francis Atkins, actually refuted the call to bring in new physicians from the East, noting that the majority of prospective patients, quote, Mexican peasants, Navajo, and Pueblo Indians, lived far from the railroads and seldom received care from physicians, while larger towns were oversaturated with medical professionals. As he argued, quote, medical service is enormously oversupplied in all or most of these towns along the railroad, and the rural districts 20 to 100 miles off from any railroad no American physician is willing to live in, and if such should live there, his pickings would be painfully small and his society nil. Atkins' own conceptualization of which patients physicians served drew a distinction between white supremacist conceptions of race, class, and nationality, wherein rural communities were a racialized foreign other. This dismissal was further reflected in physicians' continued disinterest in making their services more accessible. The few doctors that did practice in rural New Mexico as horse and buggy doctors were only able to maintain sporadic rounds that included multiple towns within miles of each community. If a patient were to seek out a physician, their own means of transportation varied. As one account observed, quote, most families had to travel by means of wagon, carriage, or pickup truck, with poor roads to make their trips. For any emergency medical situation, rural communities had few options, often opting to rely on local midwives and folk healers instead. Perhaps the most notable setback to medical professionalization in New Mexico occurred in 1883, following a veto of a medical practice bill intended to protect the public health and regulate the practice of medicine in the territory of New Mexico. The proposed bill, backed by the New Mexico Medical Society, was initially approved by the House legislature in March 1882. However, the Medical Practice Act was then vetoed by Territorial Governor Bradford Prince in February of the following year. In an address about this decision, he cited the bill's limitations and inability to account for the actual medical needs of New Mexicans, particularly women. His statement against the bill emphasized how its passage would limit the freedom of choice for patients in determining who could attend to their medical needs. As he noted, further regulation on who could practice medicine in the territory would not necessarily be harmful to those living in cities, quote, but in the county districts where there are homes of the majority of our people, where doctors are few and the distance from villages great, they would certainly be oppressive. He further emphasized how this legislation would impact midwives and women's choice and autonomy in childbirth. As he argued, quote, it is well known that in many parts of the territory, the services of a midwife are all that are usually employed in the cases of childbirth. But the bill under consideration limits that by making it illegal to employ a midwife whenever a doctor may be within possible reach. As Prince further emphasized, the language of the proposed bill would require women to utilize a physician during childbirth, regardless of their ability to pay, or otherwise, quote, she must be left alone to suffer, although a dozen competent and experienced women are at the ready to aid for the very moderate compensation to which they are accustomed. Furthermore, if the woman had any personal objections to a particular practitioner, including if they preferred a female birthing attendant rather than a male, or were just unable to communicate with a physician due to a language barrier, they would have little choice but to use that practitioner's services or deliver her child alone. As Prince noted in his 1893 veto, Physicians' own, quote, desire to fix a high standard for the medical profession in New Mexico overlooked the present conditions of the territory and the necessities of the people, especially in rural districts. This veto of the Medical Practice Act, after its initial passage in both branches of the legislature, enraged and surprised members of the New Mexico Medical Society. The legislature sustained the veto with only 9 votes out of a needed 16 in favor of repassing the bill. Subsequent versions of the Medical Practice Act bounced back and forth from the New Mexico Medical Society to the legislature and was rejected during 3 sessions before an updated version was approved in 1895 after the end of Governor Prince's tenure, which ended April 1893. The language of the bill was adjusted per former Governor Prince's criticisms, however. In addition to provisions that allowed New Mexicans to access and utilize folk healing and home remedies, midwives were expressly allowed to continue their work, as the territorial governor's report recounted in 1895. While the New Mexico Medical Society would be considered an authoritative voice for medical professionalization in the territory, it could not, quote, prohibit gratuitous services in cases of emergency or the domestic administration of family remedies or women from practicing midwifery. Through this eventual, albeit forced, consideration of rural communities in the territory, the Medical Practice Act paved the foundation for midwives and related folk healers to continue their practice throughout New Mexico's territorial period and far into its statehood. While midwives were able to practice prior to this legislation, this allowance is significant at a critical point where physicians across the nation were professionalizing and working to limit the parameters of who could practice medicine. While New Mexico physicians and governor representatives strove to present the territory as new, modern, and American, they could not directly follow the model of professionalization that barred midwives from the birthing room and mandated a more regulated, medicalized birthing experience. The path to the implementation of the Medical Practice Act further reflected the realities and limitations of professionalizing medicine in a territory dominated by an existing system of healthcare and network of folk healers that, in contrast to their accredited counterparts, were affordable, able to access patients in remote areas, spoke Spanish, and understood the cultural background of the communities they served. It is through this initial negotiation of medical legislation that folk healing and midwifery became a permanent fixture of New Mexico's medical landscape. From this point, cooperation and collaboration with lay midwives and curanderas was crucial in reaching the rural Mexican-American towns that comprised the majority of the state's population. As the New Mexico Bureau of Public Health emphasized in their reports, parteras were one of the few options available to meet the medical needs of the state. An early account noted, albeit somewhat disparagingly, that, quote, the ignorant midwife is dependent upon to give all necessary aid in childbirth. While public health officials attributed one major cause for the state's high infant mortality rate to what they felt were outdated, inadequate medical care by these midwives, they also understood the place of these folk healers as a necessary tenet of the state's medical landscape who could access communities in need. As the Bureau noted in 1922, only about 35% of the population was receiving moderately adequate service in health care. The Bureau viewed midwives as central to improving this rate, especially for maternal and infant welfare. Local midwives could both disseminate public health information and provide care to patients in need. Being able to talk to families throughout these means was critical, quote, for as the Department of Public Health noted, it is here that we come into most intimate contact with the home and have the greatest opportunity to influence the future generation of citizens. And so, beginning in 1921, the Bureau of Public Health created an educational training program led by public health nurses who trained and licensed lay midwives to provide care to communities in need, legitimizing their work and enabling the continuation of their practice into the latter half of the century. Bolstered by financial support provided through the 1921 Federal Shepherd-Towner Act, which allocated funds to improve infant and maternal health, officials and nurses within the Bureau of Public Health provided a series of educational courses on infant care, obstetrics, and home nursing. In 1925 alone, 82 midwives completed the certification program, which allowed them to officially attend births and care for mothers and children. What's more, the Bureau emphasized the general willingness of parteras to learn and listen to public health initiatives, as Shepherd-Towner nurses found the midwives eager to learn. In 1923, the Bureau notably admitted that midwives in New Mexico were, quote, a historical institution, bound up in the life of our native people. In the isolated rural community, she is all that is available in the way of obstetrical care. While this account specifically identified Native people as using parteras for care, this label was likely referring to Mexican and Mexican-American communities rather than Pueblo land or other reservations, because reporting and surveillance of disease within indigenous communities fell under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Indian Affairs rather than the New Mexico Bureau of Public Health. This terminology aside, acknowledgement from the Bureau emphasized the importance of parteras as a medical practitioner, and also a source of information who could report the spread of diseases across the state, as well as act as an intermediary to convey public health information to rural communities. As such, beyond obstetric care, parteras were seen to fulfill a vital public health need where nurses and physicians were unable to reach. It is worth noting that this reliance upon parteras was as much a strategy for the Bureau as it was a necessary solution, given community aversion toward public health services and licensed physicians. As the Bureau lamented in 1923, quote, "How are we ever to show the people of this state that public health work really amounts to something, unless we have the figures to prove it? We can talk generalities until our vocal cords are paralyzed, and the old-timer will come right back with a reply, 'I've lived here for 40 years without needing any health work, and I don't need it now.' This disinterest in public health extended to physicians, especially given the inaccessibility of their services due to distance, expense, and culture. The reliance upon folk healers and parteras would have, then, been an understood component of healthcare in the state, even as the Bureau hoped to shift favor toward their services. This sentiment was reflected in English-language newspapers as well. As one article reported in August 1921, 113 out of 248 births to date had been attended by midwives, indicating, quote, that the midwife is of vital importance when steps to better the health condition of the babies are concerned. At the same time, the report noted 2 midwives whose practice was stopped by the state because one was blind and another, quote, a dirty midwife, was forced to discontinue her practice after 4 patients died within 2 months due to blood poisoning that was attributed to her, quote, uncleanly methods. Regardless of the veracity of these claims that put the expertise of these midwives into question, the newspaper expressed the opinion that their work was secondary to that of a licensed physician. This sentiment would have been shared by public health representatives who felt that training midwives was necessary, though not ideal. As the article concluded, quote, "The midwife is at present a necessity, but efforts will be made to educate the better class of midwife and rule out those unable to come up to standards of cleanliness and intelligence." In spite of this attitude, however, midwives in the state would continue their practice well into the latter half of the 20th century, complying with shifting state requirements for certification. These courses and midwife certification were not exclusive to rural areas, however. In 1925, one report recounted how a county health department representative, A.B. Courtney, led classes for 3 months to provide education for parteras in Bernalillo County. At the end of this period, each participant was given a practical examination. In total, 37 midwives were certified, including at least 10 that lived in Albuquerque, which would have had easy access to physicians and hospitals. The certification of midwives from Albuquerque indicates that their continued practice persisted even in areas that were not considered rural and had access to physicians and Western medical facilities, and that outreach and efforts to train midwives were not limited exclusively to rural areas and regions that had no other solution. One rough estimate in 1925 reported that midwives attended around 40% of all births, though this number was likely higher given disparities in reporting births to state officials. By 1936, while physician-attended births outpaced midwives in larger cities situated along the railway, more remote regions continued to prefer the care provided by midwives and other folk healers. San Miguel County, for instance, reported that 72% of all births that year were attended by midwives within the home. Even as the Bureau hoped to phase midwives out of the state and adhere to national professionalization tendencies that saw the shift to favor physician-attended births by the 1920s, New Mexico lagged in this transition. Throughout this period, public health officials and physicians would be forced to concede both the lasting presence of midwives and their overall necessity to address the medical needs of women and children in the state. Rather than a slow transition to licensed physicians, the reliance upon midwives in rural and some urban areas remained steady, and the Bureau would admit to this significance in waves. Mirroring similar rhetoric from the 1920s, for example, a 1942 annual report from the Department of Public Health noted that, quote, "The local midwife is becoming increasingly important now that so many physicians have been called to the armed services." Here in New Mexico, she has, for many years, been recognized as an outstanding leader in the community, her influence being felt through the lifetime of the families she serves. However, rather than an increasingly important figure that took over in the stead of an absence of licensed physicians, midwives were always present and practicing, addressing the needs that physicians failed to address and providing care for women instead of, or even alongside, the care that licensed physicians and state-sanctioned health services would provide. Midwives themselves found value in the public health efforts to provide training and certification for deliveries and other obstetric work. Doña Jesusita Aragon was one such midwife who participated in the midwifery certification program in the 1930s and maintained her license until the 1980s. The courses and certification provided Aragon with medical knowledge that complemented her experience as a curandera, and she gained access to medical resources previously unavailable to her. The program equipped each participant with a few medical tools, a stack of birth certificates, and silver nitrate, all meant to improve the health of their patients. Rather than being pushed out of the birthing room by medical professionals, her relationship with physicians and institutions demonstrated a collaborative nature between these differing medical practices. Aragon's patients relied on both sources of healthcare, merging the medical service she provided with that of a licensed physician. Faith in Aragon's abilities extended to the medical community. As she noted in one instance, quote, "Once a doctor came from Santa Fe and asked me many questions and watched me. He's an obstetrician. He wanted to know how I used the olive oil and how I held the baby. He asked me so many questions. Other doctors came too. It makes me feel so good to have them come and watch me and talk with me, like they trust me." In another case, a midwife in Taos began her practice because of the encouragement of a physician, who asked her to handle deliveries and other treatments as a way to supplement his practice. According to the doctor, he covered too wide an expanse and dealt too often with transportation issues to properly attend to the births of his patients. The newly minted midwife accompanied him on these home deliveries, shadowing his work as a form of training. Through this unofficial apprenticeship, she begrudgingly began her career as a midwife. As one account noted, quote, "When called to assist at a delivery in the vicinity, Dr. Martin would simply untie the midwife's apron strings and usher her out of the kitchen, listening to no refusal. He insisted that she had to be a midwife, and so she is." Such an experience could only occur within the conditions in New Mexico that enabled physicians and midwives to work alongside each other, encouraging collaboration as a way to accommodate the statewide medical limitations. The relationship between midwives, public health nurses, and physicians was not without tension, however. The knowledge and capability of the former was constantly in question. In 1949, for example, the Department of Health published a nursing guide that anticipated midwife incompetence. The guide included a form for nurses to fill out after first contacting a midwife to verify her expertise. It included sections that asked about the midwife's experience in attending births, her certification information, community standing, and physical condition. Through thorough documentation such as this, midwives were constantly under surveillance by public health and medical officials. In the 1930s, various healthcare professionals against the midwife certification program argued that the practice of curanderismo was superstitious, dirty, and ignorant. Public health programs and initiatives echoed this sentiment. In 1936, prominent middle and upper-class women in Santa Fe formed the Santa Fe Maternal Health Center that sought, in part, to improve maternal and child welfare in the state. As part of this mission, they hoped to replace the superstitious medical practices of impoverished Mexican-American families with Western medicine and resources. In 1942, then president of the Santa Fe Maternal Health Center Board, Peach Mayer, praised the efforts of an auxiliary program that sent nurses to homes in Santa Fe and adjacent regions to educate mothers on standards of homemaking and child-rearing. As she applauded in her letter, quote, "We can feel that much has been accomplished by your work. The mother has been instructed in the care and feeding of the new baby. Certain superstitions that have been prevalent have been done away with in many cases, and many other fields have been of great value to the very poor and very ignorant of our community." In this case, unlike the other efforts in the state that utilize midwives to supplement the limitations of professionalized medicine, the Santa Fe Maternal Health Center Board did not view curanderismo as a valid form of health care. Its description of the practice emphasized it as a pre-modern cultural practice with limited, if any, benefits. While the Department of Health expressed similar distrust toward curanderismo and folk healers in the notices to public health nurses, both the method and regulating of the practice and its acceptance or rejection as a form of medicine differed. Meanwhile, for midwives, the threat of professionalized medical dominance and pressure from state surveillance remained a concern throughout the 20th century. To continue their work, midwives like Aragon had to comply with the state's regulations, negotiating and navigating a liminal space between curanderismo and Western medicine. Through the midwifery consultant program, Aragon could continue her practice, but in so doing supported programs that ultimately led to the phasing midwives out of the medical field. She further contributed to efforts of the state to extend their reach into rural communities, tracking population growth and mortality rates through birth certificates and medical reports. Through this, midwives became part of the state's modernization and assimilation efforts, which stressed methods meant to demonstrate New Mexico's growth as a state and legitimize residents as U.S. citizens. In particular, the Bureau of Public Health strongly emphasized the importance of birth certificates, which, in turn, influenced U.S. census and registration data and connected modernization efforts to U.S. nationalism, public health, and midwifery. Aragon was also expected to educate her patients on medical knowledge and state resources, disseminating information provided by the New Mexico Department of Health. In this way, midwives served as a bridge between public health efforts and the birthing room, stepping stones leading New Mexico to modernity. In spite of this tension, the impact of midwives left an indelible mark on the medical history of the state. The attempt at training and certifying lay midwives enabled the practice and much of its customs to continue into the latter half of the 20th century. Legislative documentation further authorized midwives as legitimate medical practitioners, regardless of educational background, provided that they could meet the licensure requirements. A 1944 mandate by the State Board of Public Health permitted licensed midwives like Aragon to continue their practice, and any midwife that remained unlicensed could maintain their work through a provisional permit. The permit process reinforced a pathway to licensure, even if state or medical supervision requirements were not met. This process, coined as grandmothering lay midwives into the licensure process, quote, was established with the intent that it would be temporary, and as established to meet special needs of midwives who could not satisfy the required experience, but needed registration in order to lawfully continue their practice, while preparing for and sitting the licensure examinations. As a result, midwives can continue their work and eventually attain certification, using their prior experience as justification of their medical expertise. While the number of midwives under this provisional status did drop over time, the program and option to pursue licensure through this method did not end until 1980. Until this point, practitioners considered to be lay midwives, that is, trained through apprenticeships instead of formal educational programs, still had a pathway to attain legitimacy as a health practitioner in the eyes of the state. Even as licensure requirements for midwives became stricter and the numbers of certified lay midwives dwindled toward the end of the 20th century, the prominence of figures like Aragon remained. Museums and other markers of the state's history emphasized the role of midwives as healers on par with licensed physicians. In addition to signifying an important aspect of the state's cultural past, midwives were acknowledged as an important medical resource. The state boasted of this history, an admiration that began around the 1950s and persists today. In one recent instance, in 2016, the New Mexico Public Health Association commended New Mexico's rate of midwife-attended births and nurse midwifery programs, attributing its success to Aragon, quote, a key leader in midwife care and a curandera partera registered by the state's midwife demonstration project. As I have argued, in legislation and institutional public health initiatives, as well as through patient preference and sustained efforts by folk healers to continue their practice, folk healing, midwifery, and other forms of medical pluralism were embedded into New Mexico's history as legitimate sources of health care critical to the state's well-being and progress. It is through this veneration, made possible through legislation and institutional programs, that New Mexico maintained its practice of midwifery and curanderismo. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Gianna, while I wait for Gianna to come up on screen, again, my name is Paul Reier. I'm the Director of Scholar Programs here at SAR, and thank you for watching. Please stay around for our Q&A, which is forthcoming. I see we only have so far one question. Please don't be shy to type a question into the Q&A field, and we will get to as many as possible. Gianna, thank you so much. That That was an absolutely fascinating talk, and I have lots of questions myself. So while we wait for people to come up with their own questions, if you don't mind me taking the first one, I do have several, but one of the fascinating things to me throughout your talk that is surprising and interesting is the flexibility of the colonial state, the colonialist state apparatus to work with these women, these curanderas. And that doesn't, that at first glance, that just doesn't fit with what we know of colonial states. What do you think? Is it a recognition of cultural difference, of linguistic difference, or or a recognition of the state's very own acknowledged inadequacy that drove that sort of flexibility? What do you think it comes down to?
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is actually part of the reason why I chose to use this to focus on this project, because New Mexico is such a distinct case, especially compared to the national narrative of medical professionalization and midwifery. And I sort of mentioned this in the talk, where I felt that this was partially just a result of just necessity, the sheer fact that a lot of communities in New Mexico are rural, and they're in these small Spanish-speaking communities, difficult for physicians to access. And then also there just weren't too many physicians in the state at the time. So just generally there was this need to continue relying on traditional healers, because physicians weren't fulfilling that role, and even due to their own personal bias as well. And I think there is also something distinct about the fact that, of course, when New Mexico became acquired by the US and became a state, there was already an existing system of healthcare where people would go do curanderas and other folk healers. However, in order to, when physicians would come in, rather than say just immediately switch to using physicians, cultural barriers, language, even just the fact that physicians cost money, not of course to say with transportation issues, it actually led to the system of medical pluralism, where you see a lot of folks using both curanderas and going to, Western medical facilities as well. So going to physicians, but then still keeping in mind, the fact that they can rely on a curandera, partera, what have you, in order to also meet their medical needs. So it's actually a really interesting, distinct system that I believe Pablo Mitchell discusses a bit in his book, Coyote Nation. And it sort of actually resonates even with New Mexico as an imperial site, rather than a colonial, if that makes sense, because you actually see this similar pattern of medical professionalization and medical pluralism occurring in Latin American countries.
I wonder if we would see anything like this in Louisiana. I know nothing about the medical history of Louisiana, but it also has a pre-established state that got taken over by the United States and would have in terms of what you were just describing, it might be an interesting case to look at comparatively. Anyway, enough for me. I do have more questions I hope I have time to get back to, but we have a bunch of good ones coming in. So let me start with, we had a technical question, will the recording be shared? Yes, it will. Once it's up on our YouTube channel, everyone who is registered will be sent a link by email, and you'll be welcome to watch it at your leisure on our SAR's YouTube channel. First question we have is, I'm confused by your use of the term Mexican rather than Hispanic. Can you explain?
Yeah, so this is, of course, one of the big questions. Usually, if you do any kind of research in Latino studies, Latinx populations, there's always, the sort of terminology disclaimer. And so some of this is just because the term Hispanic has its own connotations and historical uses. I mean, Hispanic as a term really didn't become more prominent until, I believe the 1930s census, basically until US started to categorize various folks as being Hispanic. And so some of that is both to acknowledge the fact that, I mean, with the time period that my project starts with, a lot of folks are, still in the process of like being considered quote unquote American citizens. I mean, the the territory of New Mexico had difficulty becoming a United States state because it was thought to be too foreign and too Catholic, too Mexican to be considered truly quote unquote American. So some of it is with just that like intentionality behind it of wanting to acknowledge that. Some of it is also due to, like I mentioned, curanderismo and parteras as being Mexican American folk healing practices. And that's just more in reference to just the sort of not lineage, but like the history in which it's connected to. As being distinctly from Mexico, which of course it evolved in its own space as New Mexicans. So generally when I write, I tend to focus on, like, I'll refer to folks as being New Mexican, but as I discuss a bit in my research, the fact that these folks are being labeled by physicians as being, Mexican peasants is significant because that plays into this sort of racial view of the New Mexican population and the community that are sort of seen as not either wanting or being able to utilize physicians for whatever reason.
Yeah. By the way, it was not until 1970 census within I'm old, so within my lifetime that the term first was used in the census. So there's a little bit of a invention of tradition kind of question there, right? I mean, that's very recent in living memory to have it.
Think that, because I know before they would refer to New Mexican as Hispano, right? Mm-hmm. However, that usually would incorporate a like upper class citizens, so rich Hispanos who have money and wealth and often weren't sort of within the like view of who would count as like the rural communities that were thought to be outliers by physicians, distinct from, economically elite.
Yeah, I mean, it is true people have their own local identity categories, and that's important. You've addressed that, and that's real, in a lot of southern Colorado, northern New Mexico, people really do self-identify as Hispanic, and that's an important, I think it's important to acknowledge that, which you just did. But it's also important to recognize those bigger questions that you're wrestling with. So good luck with that. You're going to get that question throughout your entire career.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Moving on. So much this is from Joel Zapata. So much of New Mexico's territory is at the margins of the state, both physically and socioculturally. Noting that, can you touch on the history you cover in such areas as southern New Mexico, eastern New Mexico, the Gila Forest, etc.?
Yeah, this is a good question and one that's sort of difficult for me to parse. I guess just for me, one notable pattern I saw was like there was a lot more activity and discussion happening around training and the use of midwives in northern New Mexico specifically. So I believe in Doña Ana County, I think so. That could be wrong. But in the northern New Mexico is specifically mentioned as being, a place that has a lot of, partera activity. I actually think it was San Miguel County that it was. And as part of this, some of that was because the way that the Bureau of Public Health chose to focus on training midwives, and they used San Miguel County as sort of like a testing site for what would become the midwifery consultant program in the 1930s. So that it just kind of became this targeted area. But that's not to say that the use of midwives and other things like that was exclusive to just northern New Mexico. In fact, one thing I'm still working on, I'm in the process of doing, is trying to map out like where these parteras and physicians are like located, and to sort of see if that reveals anything about the different, geospatial dynamics of everything. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a question from former resident scholar, Dr. William Calvo-Quiros, whose book is just out. Really lovely to see your question, William. How did gender and race work in the demonization of parteras by the state? Also, because gender hierarchies are also inscribed in the doctor, nurse, partera categorizations.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And yeah, so I think like gender and race are critical to specifically how physicians view parteras, and even in part why they're able to continue their practice, because they're not seen as threatening as, say, a male folk healer, a curandero, or other other person who practices medicine. So because it's sort of seen as like they can kind of slide in as being, well, this is just midwives attending births. It's not like taking over the job of a physician, not seen as threatening. However, of course, the double-edged sword of that is that, I mean, there's so much rhetoric and discussion of the practice of curanderismo, of parteras, as being superstitious and backward. And I mentioned in the presentation, one midwife was referred to as being a dirty midwife. And so that in itself also incorporates this like assumption of, this very racist view of who are using parteras and who are who are the midwives are themselves. So there just generally is this view of them as being uneducated and lesser. Recently, I was looking at some records that were talking about the high rate of infant mortality in New Mexico in the 1920s and 30s. And rather than say attributing it to malnutrition or other, sort of issues, the physicians in the New Mexico Medical Society attributed this to general ignorance, basically saying that mothers aren't educated enough to learn how to know how to take care of their babies. And so just generally there's this purveying assumption and view of those who are the most in need in New Mexico as being, inferior and unintelligent because of their race, because of the fact that they're from these small rural communities that, are Mexican American in origin. And that is just sort of overlaid upon everything.
Yeah. Here's a question from Wenda Trevathan, one of our senior scholars here at SAR. Thank you, Gianna. That was a very interesting talk. One interpretation of the regulation of midwifery in the southern US is that as long as most midwives were, quote, grannies serving African-American populations, the medical establishment, mostly white, didn't really care about regulating them. But once midwifery became attractive to white women, attempts to regulate lay midwives became important. Do you see any evidence of this sort of racialization of midwifery in New Mexico?
That's interesting. I know there are some comparative studies that definitely add interesting dimensions to my work being done in the US South. And thinking about, midwifery as appealing to, specifically white women wanting to become certified as midwives. I don't actually see that language, though, in my records, at least in terms of white women wanting to become midwives, partially because one thing is just that the practice of lay midwifery has this interesting connection to a cultural practice in New Mexico. So it has this significance as being culturally important, and being sort of a tenet of how New Mexicans identify themselves. So just some of that, just because it's so ingrained in New Mexico culture, I think is part of it. But then there's also just, I mean, one aspect being that there just weren't a lot of white women coming to New Mexico interested in practicing medicine, or becoming a midwife, at least not nearly to the same degree. Um, you get more white women involved in public health nursing, and that's where we see a lot of their activities. But I think the same barriers that sort of keep physicians from being, more oppressive in their scene is also similar detractor for white women, in that like a lot of the communities speak Spanish or only Spanish and are in these rural areas that are like not as, say, attractive as moving to a bigger town or a town along the railroad. So there just wasn't necessarily that same demand. And I think also part of it was just that some of the midwife regulation was occurring, like, or at least the permitting midwives to continue their practice was, put forth in legislation in New Mexico. So with that Medical Practice Act and these different instances of permitting lay midwives specifically from continuing their work.
I wonder if there's also a temporal question. Your project really kind of goes to mid 20th century, and it's more of sort of the hippie era that was maybe emerging 20 years later.
Yeah, that's true. No, I think that's a good point.
Because there certainly are lots of midwiferys now in New Mexico that appeal to different kinds of New Mexicans.
Yes.
So anyway, here's the next question. I love it. We're getting all these great questions. Thank you all, everyone viewing. This is from Deborah Winslow, who's also a senior scholar here at SAR, and she writes, fascinating talk, which of course made me think about comparisons with midwives elsewhere. For example, I am curious if you have thought about the differences you see between the situation for midwives in New Mexico and what Laurel Thatcher Ulrich described for 18th century midwives in Maine. The domination of male physicians seems similar, but the cultural context is quite different. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess just for those who don't know, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich did a analysis of, I believe her name was Margaret Baller's diary, basically the diary of a prominent midwife in 18th century Maine. I think, of course, one big difference between that is just the temporality of everything. I mean, 18th century, at this point, physicians weren't necessarily organized as like the collective that we're more familiar with today. So the process of medical professionalization, that is physicians coming in and saying, this is what you need in order to be a physician. This is your degree. This is how you're supposed to act and behave and how you're supposed to certify yourself, really didn't start happening until the 1800s. And then, sort of ramped up into the 1900s as them asserting their position more as these figures of authority who could push midwives and other practitioners out because they weren't, in their view, qualified to practice medicine. And so sort of that temporality is key to it. And just, of course, with New Mexico, there are all these other small factors that actually sort of delay this process of medical professionalization, or at least enable more of a more like complex system of medical pluralism to persist.
Here's a great question from Jerome Alona. Thanks so much. You spoke of a medical pluralism, and I'm wondering, were pre-statehood curanderas paid, or was it more a community-supported model? Did New Mexico's transition from territory to statehood change a person's repayment of curandera practices?
I think it was very community-based. So there's a lot of references of, either just being like pay what you can for midwives, or, I believe Jesucita Ergon talks a bit about her payment system, which initially she wouldn't charge. And like sometimes it would just be more of this, like, not necessarily bartering, but like this more of an exchange within the community. And then eventually she would like charge like $10 or $15, $30 going up as time went on, because she practiced up until the 1980s and 70s, I believe. And so, she had her own like set rate, but like by and large, one thing that I think also distinguished parteras is that most of them wouldn't charge, or they wouldn't charge like the fees you would get from physicians. So one thing, of course, physicians were constantly talking about was just, or one sort of conflict they had with a lot of folks in New Mexico was the fact that they, cost so much money to use. And this was, not even considering if people had insurance or not. And so, while they would charge these, bigger fees, making them inaccessible, parteras would often, have either just generally lower fees or, have their own systems of payment. And, it wasn't really regulated by the state in terms of how much money they would charge.
Here's another question. I'm not sure. I think you've addressed how you were thinking of it already, but were there efforts in New Mexico to professionalize curanderas as distinct from parteras? Your talk indicates that the two categories often overlapped, at least for women. Did the two trajectories diverge, and if so, how?
Yeah, I think that for that, there actually wasn't an effort to professionalize curanderos or curanderas. Some of that is because of the gendered aspect of it. And I think especially for the medical community, rather than say a female healer, having a female midwife was a bit easier for them to parse and swallow as being an adequate, it's not encroaching upon their field too much. And I think some of this also comes with the sort of conflation too of curanderas and parteras. So curanderas I used to refer to Mexican American / Mexican folk healers broadly, right? And then parteras can derive from curanderismo. They have similar practices, but they're not they don't always cover everything. It's more of a specialized position within curanderismo. And it wasn't necessarily, professionalized in the state, at least in the same way. And some of that is, again, because of how parteras were viewed by the state. Some of it was also because in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, there was a lot of emphasis on improving infant and maternal mortality because we had a very high rate at the time. And so, one major way to get at that was to address parteras as being, the main focus, rather than just curanderas broadly.
Here's a question from Ann Quarles. Today, the public continues to utilize what the AMA would consider alternative medicine. Many physicians have no problem with patients using a combination of Western and alternative medicine. Doesn't this seem to reflect the continued acceptance of other traditions, as well as acceptance that the state has an inadequate number of physicians?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the difference, just the sort of distinction to draw is what traditional healers are allowed to practice. So how are they allowed to call themselves a healer or not? Versus, sort of different ways of phrasing it and how adjacent is it to being seen as a medical professional. I will also say, just nationally, this idea of alternative medicine tends to be one dominated by, white folks, because it's, in part just because in order to attain that certification and ability to even go to an alternative medical practitioner, you have to have, financial resources either to, learn the trade and get your certification, or if you're a patient going to one, you have to be able to afford their services, which often are not covered by insurance. However, I think, at least in New Mexico, there still is people still follow practices of curanderismo, albeit again, it's always sort of on the side. And a lot of that just sort of comes down to what is accessible for folks. But, it's especially in New Mexico, the idea of using traditional methods of healing and having the system of medical pluralism is just part of its also cultural history.
Here's a question from Carol McLennan. This is an important history to uncover. In your research, did you find ethnographic or ethnohistorical information on specific practices of midwives that give a sense of divergence from that of professional doctors, such as medicines, practical methods of delivery, etc.? Were any of these practices tension points between midwives and doctors?
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately there aren't as many records as I would like from just various midwives and their different practices. With Jesucita Aragon, she has a biography, La Partera, that was written about her that has some information of her practices. And with that, you actually do see the tension between midwives and physicians, especially in terms of, she mentions physicians consulting her for advice, because she used olive oil as a way to prevent tearing. And there's these other methods. However, there also is labeling a lot of practices with midwifery as being superstitious. And this would usually refer to, any kind of practice that was semi-religious methods being used. So also there was the idea that whatever midwives were doing was in some way backward or based off of superstitious, non-scientific practices, regardless of if it was actually useful or not. And so, yeah, but in terms of say different practices between different midwives, I'm still in the process of trying to sort of parse that out and figure out, where do these different threads of the practice of midwifery how do they differ and where do they come together?
Here's a question from Judith Mikchalk. And I'll be honest, I don't understand these acronyms, so I hope you do. Is there documentation on IMR and MMR changes with training of parteras that was done?
I actually do not know those acronyms either. I'm sorry.
Judith, if you're still watching and you can fill us in, I will come back to that if you're still here. Here's another.
It's infant mortality and maternal mortality, right?
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Okay.
Yeah. There was some documentation of it, but it sort of remained steady. It did go down a little bit starting 1930s, but it was still sort of counted as being one of the highest in the nation up until the 1940s. So I think some of that, on the one hand, indicates that training of parteras and midwives was more significant to the state than the, women who were receiving the care, mostly for their own purposes of saying, oh, well, now that, they're not allowed to practice their own superstitious practices anymore. But at the same time, I think it didn't necessarily address the root of the problem, which a lot of the time would be issues of malnutrition and access to resources. So if anything, I believe there at least was some improvement in that midwives could use physicians as resources for any kind of, emergency situation. But at the same time, it's sort of questionable as who was this training really for? And how did the state interpret the mortality rates? How did they attribute it? Where did it come from? And it wasn't because, midwives themselves were at fault in their practice.
Here's actually a more of a comment than, so let me read this as a comment from Janice Crosby, and there's two, I'll put them together. As a licensed midwife myself in the 1980s and 90s, the respect held by Hispanics here for midwives allowed me to achieve legal changes that were then used in other states. The C-section rate in New Mexico is lower than other states due to the local midwives and Army nurse midwives who supported a more human method of birth. So those are really interesting comments that speak to the question of temporality we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And I mean, even I believe the University of New Mexico has one of the more prominent nurse midwifery programs in the nation. And there is just this continued sort of legacy of acknowledging and including midwives in this process of birth. And I mean, even as we have these conversations about like the issues of, say, the rate of C-sections in births in the US, in part because of this like overemphasis on medical intervention, it's interesting to see how New Mexico sort of fits into this, like, you know, it has this historical trajectory of using midwives and relying on them, in part just because of necessity, but this rich cultural history. And then it's unfortunate because a lot of the time, you know, using midwives or doulas or what have you can be restricted to who has the financial means to do so. Whereas this has this, like, you know, previous very rich tradition. But that being said, you know, it's still very heartening to see even folks like Aragon be celebrated within like UNM's, you know, own discussion of nurse midwives and obstetrics.
Well, that is the last of the questions in the Q&A. We had a couple in the chat, and those are actually, I'm not sure they were intended to be questions for everyone. I appreciated them, but I think this one maybe. So may I read this out from Alyssa Kenny Geyer. This is fascinating. I chief-sponsored midwifery legislation in Oregon in 2013 to make licensing cheaper and require it for all midwives, but not make it illegal to practice without a license. Unlicensed midwives must disclose that they don't have a license to their patients. We had to fight some of the same misperceptions that New Mexico midwives faced over the decades. So kind of, again, comparative thinking. I do have more questions myself, Gianna, but I think, honestly, I think we've asked a lot here. Oh, wait, do we have one more? If we have time, from Jerome. I can always ask you myself the follow-up questions. So here's an additional question from Jerome Alona. If we have time, he says, you referenced multiple instances of educational bias against New Mexicans throughout the time period. Was there a physicians' university program that was treated similarly in New Mexico during that time? Also, yes, Loveless Women's here in Albuquerque has a really dedicated nurse midwifery program. Yeah,
so thank you for that. That's really good to know. And then also, yeah, there actually wasn't a program, at least in the 1920s and 30s, I believe, for training physicians in the state. A lot of the time they would, you know, go to Colorado, or you get a lot more physicians coming from other parts of the United States and coming into New Mexico. There wasn't like a dedicated educational program for them. And then once it was established, it was, you know, sort of emphasized as being set to this national standard. But some of that was also fueled by, I mean, at the time, physicians were concerned about how they were viewed by the rest of the nation, because they wanted to be viewed as equal to, you know, all other physicians. They wanted to be part of this like collective of professionalized medical practitioners. And, you know, being in New Mexico had this, like, you know, frustrating identity as, again, not being American, not being backwards, being uneducated, in need of like some kind of proper guidance. So a lot like of their efforts to, say, push a medical practice act was in an attempt to show that New Mexico was up to the same like medical professional rigor as the rest of the nation.
Well, thank you. Those are great questions, and that was a great discussion. I really appreciated it. And I think with that, we should call it a day. That's been really terrific. Gianna, thank you so much. I hope that the writing continues to go really well. We'll be here to have conversations throughout the year, I hope. So thanks everyone for tuning in. So with that, I'm going to sign off. Again, thank you so much, Gianna.
Thank you.
Everyone. Okay.